Hello everyone, today we talk about the Gepids. This is for our holidays special about the peoples of migration era. And we talk about this people that is by far, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating and mysterious at the same time. The migration era, not excessively documented, but seemingly having played still a very important role in the catalyzation of many important processes. Importantly, also the ultimate fall of the Hanik Empire, and having especially had a very important impact in the political and strategical situation of the Danubian Basin, the Middle Danube, the Carpathian Basin, chiefly between the 5th to 6th century, and a people that disappeared, right? Towards, in fact, the second half of the 6th century proper as such, but actually had an important legacy on its own, despite it was fundamentally split between the Avars that kept basically ruling the areas where these population had settled, and partly being absorbed by the Longobards that essentially brought them in Italy. And in here, there is actually a lot of historiographical debate about all the process of settling and the dynamics that brought, especially to the final settlement in the Carpathian Basin, simply because of shortage of evidence at many levels, and the Gepids in Latin, Gepide or Gepede, right? Here there is a lot of variations. We'll look at that more. Are considered, I think, fairly evident, and there's an Eastern Germanic tribe. Right, and they lived in this area corresponding, at least in the moment of their final settlement, today's Romania, Hungary, and Serbia, right, roughly between the Tisza, the Sava, and the Carpathian Mountains. They were closely related, or even a subdivision of the Goths, right, and the relation with the Goths at this point we will see is very strained and controversial, but at the same time very evident. They are first mentioned by Roman sources in the 3rd century, together actually with certain, for the first time, certain chunks of the Gothic peoples that we made actually a video on both the so-called Visigoths and Ostrogoths that, however, have this very important role in the migration era, but at the same time very controversial origin as far as their ethnogenesis is concerned. This we will see it briefly later concerning the fabrication of certain historiographical narratives on where these peoples stemmed from, like, or at least how they came to be the ones that at a certain point, much later centuries, were defined as such, sometimes actually not even, because even for the Goths, especially how we call them as an approximation, was fully matured in the 6th century, and in a deeply Roman, not even Romanized, but properly Roman context at that point. But that's another issue. In the 4th century, the Gepids were among the peoples incorporated into the Hanik Empire, right? It's essentially half of Europe was with Rome, the other half was with the Huns. And even here the relation is complex, but the Gepids had a very important role under the Hunnic domination, together with the same Ostrogoths, right? And as we said before, they even contributed eventually to collapse the same Hanik Empire, as after the death of Attila, the Gepids under their leader Ardaric led an alliance of other peoples who had been under the Huns and defeated the sons of Attila. They were keeping to rule, actually, right? The Hunnic domination had been crippled, but it was still living under his descendants. And who also had allies among the other Germanic peoples, so we'll see some others at least, we'll see it better. Also the relation with the Ostrogoths here is key. In this battle, the Battle of Nedao, 454, and the Gepids and their allies eventually founded kingdoms on the Middle Danube, bordering on the Roman Empire, right? And the Gepid kingdom was, in this sense, one of the most important and long-lasting of these, centered on Sirmium, or at least, trying to fix their center on it. Sirmium, as you know, dramatically important center in the Roman province of Pannonia, located on the Sava River, right, the modern Sremska Mitrovica, right, in northern Serbia. And the Gepidic kingdom was referred sometimes also as with the name of Gepidia, as the land of the Gepids. It covered a large part of the former Roman province of Dacia, or Dacia if you prefer, north of the Danube, right? So lands that actually didn't belong to the empire anymore, because since the time of Aurelian, the Romans had basically withdrawn, but that had been Romanized, that were bordering, as we've seen, on the Roman Empire. And compared to other Middle Danubian kingdoms, it remained relatively uninvolved with Rome as well, right? And we'll see also what the contraction of the empire in these lands, what brought in terms of this, very long-lasting frontier area that would remain also during the Middle Ages, and where, in fact, these areas were never fully stabilized in a certain sense, and were difficult to control. The settlement in the Carpathian Basin here is in Transylvania is the key of very tough lands that also provided some shelter and relative, in fact, uninvolvement with the surroundings. And the Gepids were eventually defeated, as we said before, by the Longobards and the Avars jointly. A century later, these events in 567, Constantinople had different relations with these peoples, and at some point they simply let them die when they saw at least that their attempt to back them against the Longobards in the latter phase, as before it had been the other way around, as the Gepids actually were a thorn in the side on Sirmium and Singidunum, etc. It is a very important strategical stronghold between the Balkans and the Pannonian plain. And some Gepids, as we said, joined the Longobards in their subsequent migration into Italy. Some moved into Roman territory as well, while other Gepids instead still lived in the area of the Old Kingdom after it was conquered by the Avars. And in this we should also stress, as most updated studies now do, that among the various problems that we have to define what is specifically Gepidic, as far as also what were these peoples at the end of the day, a very important contribution is to be noted for these pre-existing populations that were there, where the Gepids moved in, but also that kept informing their culture, their politics, and would at the end of the day blend with them and live on, right? Also in part with this Gepidic legacy. As a matter of fact, in areas that had important, in fact, identities in a way on their own, in the long run. Surely the migration era was a moment in which there was a lot of sweeping around, a lot of changes, a lot of even the population, because all the transformations weren't easy, right? It was constant warfare going on. It was pretty dramatic, and also the broader situation was worsening, as you know, towards especially the second half of the 6th century, economical, demographic crisis, and so on. So also what contracts and when crystallizes at this point is important, because it's going to live on for an important amount of time on those bases. So speaking of the name of the Gepids, the most common Latin spellings of the Gepid name in plural use the P, right? Gepids, right? But there were important variations concerning the vowels. Gepide, Gipide, Gipede, Gepides. Similarly, Procopius, writing in Greek, uses a stamp which sounds as Gepid, and all these forms are interpreted by modern linguists essentially as Gothic influence. Right, and we know from other linguistical forms, from Longobard, Old Norse, and Old English, that however the P, right, would have originally been actually a B sounding like. And modern linguists therefore reconstruct the original Germanic form as Gepidots or Gepidots, based on the Germanic verb to give, right, as it's evident, still found in English, and apparently indicating that they named themselves gifted or rewarded or generous. This is also where I got the title of the video from, that I attached this kind of stigma considering the ethnonym of the people given on it, but it's uncertain, but still it's much and it's surely much more accurate or coherent anyway with the etymologies than instead other authors at the time gave, that are almost surely wrong, but still they are important because they give sometimes also important information about the perceived past of those peoples at the time, right? And the Gepids are generally equated also to the people mentioned in the Old English Vidsit and also Beowulf as Giftas or Geftas, right? And these names are etymologically equivalent Old English forms of Gepida, right? They could not have arisen through borrowing from attested Latin forms. And there are certain characters that, if you read the poems, are pretty evident. The Vidsit makes this list of Germanic peoples that include also the leaders and so on. They're a bit detached, but let's say that these names lived on, as we'll see later, also with certain kings in the Germanic epics, as the deeds of these populations were perceived as important. As we'll see, the Gepids had a role that it's not that they're dramatically, they're not often perceived as some of the big ones of the migration era, but the point is that they also had, the perspective is a bit false given the places where they were, the availability of sources and so on. They had a rough time. It also an important role, right? And I think they deserve more credit. So regarding the medieval etymologies, Jordanes in the 6th century reported in his Gothic origins story, the Getica, that the name of the Gepids came from Gepanta. That was an insult in Gothic, meaning essentially sluggish, stolid. The term used in Latin is pigra, right, so lazy, fundamentally, because the Gepids had lagged behind their Gothic kin when they migrated more than 1,000 years earlier. We will read actually the passage later. Isidore Savy, it is also way more detached. So Jordanes, as you know, here, let's not digress on the Getica, but let's say the problem is what we were saying before, that the Goths largely suffered, historiographically speaking, in terms of accuracy, of reliability. These reconstructions that came essentially from Romanized context of many centuries later, not just the ethnogenesis of these peoples, but also sometimes their end or their settlement in the places where eventually they would be mostly known, that they entered the Roman raider and so on. And these are stories that are, it's not that the Germans had anything comparable in a literary form, so that they are narratives that surely contain some actual information from a historical past as a perceived one, but we can't trace the unreliability of such information, not just because of certain evidence that is conflicting up to a certain point, in the sense that we know otherwise nothing else about it, right? Because that's really how it is, right? Until they entered the Roman raider, we know nothing of these peoples, and that's the real problem of it. And archaeology cannot answer, because archaeology can tell us a freaking deal about what the material culture of broad areas really were, but it cannot tag, right, who was who there, right? We haven't literally the slightest idea, right? Unless we have an actual historiographical work that tells us, look, there was a people that lived fundamentally there in this geographical location. Then we can't go look on the ground and say, okay, well, here at this time we can't date this evidence, and we may assume that was the people, right? But for most of these populations, actually, we cannot do that, and the Gepids, unfortunately, are part of them. Well, however, but the most important thing here is realizing that the historiographical reasons for which such, say, broad political, cultural reasons for which these historiographical works will be written, right, in a Roman context, is that they needed to tell a story that detached from what the traditions of these peoples concretely were, right? They had a completely different approach. We know it from surviving ones, actually. So, yes, these informations are fundamentally unreliable, and yet they tell us, maybe they give us a hint. They tell us something that can be connected to a certain dynamic. We'll see better with the history of the boats and the relation with the gods. So that surely there was at the bottom of truth in part, but it's so modified, it's so twisted, it's so re-elaborated that we have to be extremely careful whatever we read. We're not talking about another source like Isidore of Seville, that aside from the fact of being in a much more distant context, literally, culturally, and even geographically from the Gepidic lands of the time, that as far as Jordanus was concerned, but invents literally the thing, because in his etymologies, the author interpreted the second part of the Gepid name as feet, from the Latin pedis, right? So in explaining that the Gepids were known for going into battle on foot, he calls them pedestri, literally, in Latin, rather than mounted. But about this, we'll see. There is an interesting evidence about how the Gepids fought. That can be another literary invention, but here we're talking really about fantasy at a point. And however, the much later 12th century Byzantine Etymologicum Magnum interprets the name of the Gepids using the Greek word for children, making the Gepids essentially the Gepids, right? Meaning the children of the gods, equating them to the Jedi. This is interesting because at least we know that there was a connection with that. So in the High Middle Ages, this was still between the gods and Gepid was recognized. And in fact, this is consistently the most important datum we get altogether from these etymologies, because all three of these texts follow a tradition of seeing the Gepids as literally offshoots of or close relatives of the gods, right? As far as the Gepidic language, right, we have a very little direct evidence, at least of their original language. But they were clearly at least Gothic in culture. We're talking specifically of material culture, broadly meant. There were important influences also from the Merovingian area, but that's also a bit of a, bit of a tag that doesn't render justice to the broader homogeneity as it generally existed across all these very wide European areas. And yet, yes, we think they were in fact much more similar to the Goths than from the Alban, Thuringian, Frankish group, like as the Longobards, for example, but were important intersections in terms of material culture. And here we're talking also of the Roman sources fundamentally associating the Gepids to this Gothic, we can call it not even branch or family, but let's say milieu. It's a bit better, as we'll see now. And the 6th century Byzantine writer Procopius lists the Gepids among the so-called Gothic nations specifically, along with the Vandals, that we know were something different but still considered for this sense East Germanic, the Visigoths, and the Goths proper, right, in his Wars of Justinian, sharing the same language, white bodies, blonde hair, and Aryan form of Christianity, which was, by that time, 6th century, was essentially what the Germanistic political, stereotype was fundamentally about, right? The idea that there was a difference fundamentally between the Romans and the Germans. It was also ethnical, cultural, and also religious, like Catholicism and Arianism. Broadly meant, naturally, this is also a cliche that the same Romans actually reinforced more, but naturally the thing was more shaded, and also the Germans were much more concerned about mostly the military accomplishment, standard of measurement, we could say, just as like the Romans at that point they believed they had already definitely acquired it. Well, the Germans were struggling to prove that it was their thing too, that the military right to rule in a divine, in fact, properly divine, religious and military sense. So speaking of Gepidic history, so all the information of the Gepids' origins came from this pretty messed up set of Gothic legions recorded in Jordanes Getica after 550, right? So it's pretty late. It passes through certain literary and historiographical elaboration that we know had lots of things not working. That tells you how few we know altogether about these populations, and it's normal for those times standards. And according to Jordanes' narration, the northern island of Skanza, right? So here it's a broader geographical idea of Skandia fundamentally, and southern Sweden. And it was this ambiguity between the idea of an island in itself. But these are all things that do not really matter. Modern scholars associate it with Sweden, but the important thing is that in Jordanes' times, the idea of Scandinavia as the vagina of peoples from all these populations came out is already the trope. It's the historiographical cliche. It's the idea that these were barbarians that came out of the wild north, and that they were just about that, and that there is this direct connection. Now, as you know, and I said this in all my videos about similar topics, I'm actually, okay with the idea that these populations actually came from Scandinavia, much more than what contemporary history does in general, saying since we do not have any complete direct evidence, then we cannot say that they came from there. Yes, but when we have let's say, an explicit evidence, yeah, we can still doubt about it, but it's still the only thing we have. And these were definitely not the only populations that traced back to this connection with the broader north. We actually find it demonstrated for other peoples, or at least it all points to that direction. This, however, has nothing to do, naturally, with the broader process of ethnogenesis that took place ever since these peoples eventually got on the continent, where sometimes there were already Germanic peoples before them, sometimes, but many others, and especially as far as the Eastern Germans are concerned, we know consistently less about the ethnic, let's say, blending that they underwent than, say, compared to the Elbe Germans or to the West Germans. The reason being that we simply know dramatically less, because the Roman Empire was not there, about northeastern Europe, right? And we know that there were populations that differed at a certain point. There were, as we've seen, Germans, Celts, Proto-Slavs, other populations, other ethnic groups that unfortunately we do not know. I mean, the picture might have been actually more homogeneous, because also what could have been this dramatic difference between these populations. But at the same time, we also get the distinct idea that during the migration era, that especially as far as the eastern you go, and the list is difficult to put a boundary to, because the poorer, the wilder these lands were, and the more unstable the political blocks would be, right? Where there is an important wealth and there is an elite that controls it. I mean, it's at least easier, first of all, to track that historically, but also to maintain a certain order, at least even if upheavals can be more devastating at a point. There tends to be a more concrete solution. These other populations, as we know, think about the ethnogenesis of the Slavs, and so these are dramatically debated and unfortunately undocumented dynamics that also, ethnogenetics cannot really disclose, archaeology cannot really disclose, and not history can, right? So we have just to be humble and say, okay, well, this is where there is a gray area. We do not know clearly what happened. But we can at least get some hint from. Also, these peoples moved through this. I mean, the idea of the connection with Scandinavia is naturally that these peoples basically settled on the Baltic shores and eventually entered the continent with the Goths, as you know, or at least or wherever they call themselves, because that's all the debate there, right? That there is no proof that this ethnonym or ethnogenesis was there since the beginning. That the Goths that we talk about, even just even if they didn't call it like them, but by 3rd century Ukraine launching this important kingdom, launching raids in the Eastern Mediterranean and so on, might have not necessarily have dramatically in common with those who I'm actually fairly honest about. They actually left Scandinavia to settle in. We talk about the Traditionskern, this idea of a core fundamentally of ethno cultural identity around which other peoples fundamentally gathered and were glued and were in fact Germanized, but they weren't quite the same thing. This is truer in the East than in the West, right? As the East also was importantly populated, there were populations that were also importantly dynamic. That we know, we speak, generally speaking, for these Eastern Germanic reality of a almost Sarmato-Germanic reality. So it's very complex. And about the Goths, we know an awful lot more. About the Gepids, unfortunately, a few. But the story goes here, according to for Jordanus, as fundamentally the Goths and the Gepids had stamped from there. They left Skanza together, and the history goes that they left on 3 boats under the leadership of Beric, the legendary Gothic king. It's also a name associated to a people that might have lived in the southernmost area of Scandinavia. This is also of Sweden specifically. This is also very conjectural. But still we find this important link of the idea of the boats, of the crossing of the Baltic, and which is common to many of these peoples, and also to traditions that were not filtered by Roman or Romanized historiography. Jordanus specified that the Gepids' ancestors traveled in the last of the 3 ships. Right, so first of all, we get this idea that there were groups of people, so there were just one people, right? For others, they had a very specific identities. They just left, right? They may have been led by different leaders, which is also an important indicator, but at least there is a sense of unity of sort was maintained afterwards. Here we find it's as if was the same thing, but 3 distinct groups properly. And as we said before, Jordanus explains that the Gepid fellows, the Goths in this case, mocked them as Gepanta, so slow and stolid, because they had been the last of the 3 ships, the last to arrive, which may mean, if we want to rationalize this, which is not a healthy exercise to demonstrate, at least, if you hope to demonstrate anything by it, that they essentially were maybe a less enterprising group compared to the others. Those who were maybe more uncertain just followed the rest of the group to see because it was at risk, right? It's not that you arrived in these lands, it was now and there. You had to fight, right? To resolve the crossing. Scandinavia, in many ways, was a much more peaceful reality than what the continent was. There is the passage from the Zippe to the Comitatus, this important militarization, sometimes properly Vodanic adoption. And however, it speaks, and this is at least what I care about to understand a bit in this comparative analysis we make of the migration era peoples, how mostly politically cohesed, right, these populations were. I mean, how strong were they? Because that strength ratio could help us also determine how likely or not it was for these peoples to do certain things, eventually certain wars they fought, what their strength might have been at the end of the day. They didn't have infinite demographic resources, so a defeat, for example, could be a very important crippling factor for the unity of these peoples. They could make them move alongside others. So we'll see, because the Gepids are a bit surprising in this. They go back and forth between victories and defeats, and they are definitely very fascinating. So the Goths and the Gepids, according to Jordanus, that settle along the southern shore of the Baltic Sea on an island at the mouth of the Vistula River. That's where the Goths basically rose up, right, towards the east, towards the heart of Europe. And this land was known as Gepidoius, or the Gepids' fruitful meadows by Jordanus. These peoples wanted fresh pastures, right? That's where they migrated for. They starved, they wanted new land, either because they were threatened or because they didn't have enough land to feed all the offsprings. they had because of climate warming, whatever the reason had brought to that, but can be consistently just political. So they had to acquire new lands, and surely new fruitful land was already occupied by someone else. So that's how the thing began. So modern historians debate whether the part of Jordanes' work which describes the migration from Skansa was written at least partially on the basis of Gothic oral history, where presumably all this information would have come from in a certain way. You can imagine even here the important modifications over time, especially regarding such large and composite groups like the Goths were, right? The smaller peoples, paradoxically, if they made it through, they had, in fact, not surprisingly, not necessarily or always more coherent information, but at least it's easier to track, right? And modern scholars think that actually what Jordanes is writing is a historical fabrication of some sort, right? And we can actually read Jordanes' passage in his Getica, because it says, quote, "Should you ask how the Goths and Gepids are kinsmen, I can tell you in a few words. You surely remember that in the beginning I said the Goths went forth from the bosom of the island of Skansa with Beric, their king, sailing in only 3 ships towards the hither shore of the ocean, namely to Goddess Skansa. One of these 3 ships proved to be slower than the others, as is usually the case." So this is interesting because it says, there's always someone who comes later, right? Remember that migration dynamic we said before, right? They naturally, who leads is usually the stronger, right? And there's always someone behind it, and they cared about this, right? It was not just a mere racial force, but they were struggling, competing also from each other for leading this new migration, for having something to say in the place where they would have arrived, even to have a command on the whole thing, right? And continuing the quote, "And thus is said to have given the tribe their name, for in their language Jepanta means slow. Hence it came to pass that gradually and by corruption the name Gepida was coined for them by way of reproach, for undoubtedly they too trace their origin from the stock of the Goths, right? But because, as I have said, Jepanta means something slow and stolid, the word Gepida arose as gratuitous name of reproach." So I'm personally struck by 2 things in this passage. The first one, we mentioned it, is actually the idea that, aside from the, it's obvious that the ethnonym is false, right? These peoples could have not called themselves like the slow ones, right? The Goths might have think they were those ones, but, if you are a Gepid, you do not want to have such a, say, a bad name, which is actually, it could even be a possibility, telling you the truth. You would be surprised sometimes, even in Germanic history, how there were certain individual names that actually were insulting, in a sense. And we also should get acquainted to the concept of how names were actually given at the time, which wasn't like, even a matter of personal choice. There was a deep connection with broader identities, with the religious ideas and so on. Definitely all military and political matters concerned were religious, right? But it's still accurate. I mean, the idea that probably there was really the memory of that travel, that something had happening there that they would still talk about and define in a sense. And the other very interesting thing is that Jordanes says that the same Gepids actually trace their origin from the stock of the Goths, right? Which is another thing that, if he had invented it, he would have simply said, they stem from the Goths. No, it says they say, they think, they trace their origin. At least might have not even been true. I mean, this is subtle, actually, information that they came from the Goths, and that this might have also been connected. Were they actually not part of the Gothic people proper? And we've seen the ambiguities in there. I mean, the Vandals definitely weren't, but they still were close to them, in a sense. That there was a certain pride attached, especially by the 6th century, saying, we were part of the Goths, like of the big ones, those who made it, right, who rule this time on Italy, on Spain, on Aquitaine, and that are the most Romanized, the most important, definitely. So that may have been a thing, and this connection, given just the geographical locations, the timeline, might have been true, honestly. So this is still important information. it can't be dismissed entirely like a fabrication. Of course, the thing of both can be, and the same name that has been attached might have been in many ways. It's likely, at least, maybe. But the broader idea of the dynamic of this indirect information is provided is, I think, interesting because it's plausible. Then, according to Jordanus, the Gepids decided to leave Gepidoius during the reign of a king named Fastida. The name of these kings are sometimes very, generic, but they're probably the same figures are historical fabrication in a sense, right? There's a list of kings we know here and there. We do not know exactly how many there were. There was surely not a single king. These were certain chieftains that rose to certain preeminence and that accomplished something at a point, but behind the name of a person can be even multiple leaders, as it was normally the case, right? These were not kingdoms in the way we intend them. That was something actually alien to Germanic culture in many ways. I don't think we have any evidence of how socially stratified the Gepids could be before the settlement in the Carpathian Basin. More of that later. But let's say that it was remembered at a point the Gepids had achieved this, that they surely had a leader at the time. And it's important because the association of a king to the migration program, to the idea that they left from the land they had settled to go somewhere else, is also correct, because these leaders were normally elected during properly the migration time to organize the expedition and especially to command these people during the crossing that meant to clash against other populations. In fact, we read the story. Jordanus claims that the Gepids moved to the south long after the Goths had already moved, which already is in synchrony with the idea of the last ones, right, of the last boat, and still on land evidently. And the Gepids are said to have defeated the Burgundians and other races, provoking the Goths in the process. This is also another very interesting information, because first of all, we do not clearly know where the Gepids could be located at this time. It could be modern-day Poland, but we'll speak now of the lands where they dwelled, which doesn't seem excessively like it, if not, in the pre-Carpathian area. And it says they defeated the Burgundians, that in fact are reported, that they were people, we made a video on them, it's pretty old, maybe we'll remake them, that, suffered important defeats at some point. And this speaks, however, for a consistent strength of the Gepids at this time, right? It may have been less than the Goths, as we've seen in many ways, but there were still no people to kid with. Fastid, according to Jordanus at this point, demanded land. And this is the important part, is that the Goths get annoyed by this, right? They don't like the Gepids to move further. They say, these were the last ones. They do less than us. We have already accomplished so much settling in our lands. The Goths stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea, right? The richest, especially the part in the Ukraine. And these newcomers were definitely annoying. And yet they thought they could accomplish something evidently, so they are not just harmless. And at this point, Jordanus says that Fastida demanded land from Ostrogoths, that was king of the Visigoths, right? And here, remember, Jordanus is writing at a time in which already the concept of Visigoths is being created, barely, and even there through an historiographical invention from Ostrogothic Italy that defined mostly like the Ostrogoths actually as the true gods and the Visigoths as, say, the gods of the West, right? That's how the thing was created, right? Because before they had different names and identities, and there were composite systems. So even here, king of the Visigoths, what does it mean exactly, right? We do not clearly know. But still, we can't get the idea that these were the gods that were perceived even at the time as not the Ukrainian ones, let's say, the Ukrainian plains, but specifically this other area in today's modern days Poland, right? They were the poorer ones, and that's what the Gepids might have, the people the Gepids might have knocked at the door of, to say, look, we want to come in, right? They asked this idea that the Gepidic king asked for the Visigoths to, to even to some land to these people. So that's also kind of a threat, right? The reason being for this request, as Jordanus says, that the Gepids' territory was, quote, hemmed in by rugged mountains and dense forests, right? Some people said, this sounds very much like Transylvania, where they eventually settled. It doesn't sound much like it. Or at least we don't think it was the case. There's a few evidence that at that height, whatever, this have actually happened. These might have been the Precarpathians, in my opinion. Or even maybe the Sudeten. I know, think about the fact that Gepids had defeated the Burgundians. The Burgundians dwelled more or less towards those areas, where before the Lugi or the Vandals, the Quadi had stayed at some point. We simply do not know. But this sounds like it's coherent with the idea of a move towards the south. In this plains south of the Baltic, there isn't much rugged terrain. It's all flatland, right? There are forests. Yes, there were more than today at that time, but this description of the mountains and dense forests, rugged mountains especially, sounds very much like these guys had arrived to the Carpathians in a way or another. So at this point, according to the story, Ostrogotha refused Fastida's demand, and the Gepids joined battle with the Goths. Big clash between the two of them. At the time, I quote, according to Jordanus, the town of Galtis, near which the river Aua flows, and do not know, I think, at all what these toponyms actually mean, and they fought until darkness fell, when Fastida and his Gepids withdrew from the battlefield and returned to their land. This is interesting because it sounds like a hard-fought battle, right? That was not over until darkness, so there was a chance for the Gepids really to break through this apparent western part of the Gothic people and take their land, but they are defeated. So they return to their land. This land is not on the Baltic anymore, but that rugged, mountained, dense forest one, right? But this is just a legend, right? We know it just from Jordanus. Here, interesting things start to happen. However, considering the broader international situation now, of the time, the Gepids, as we've seen, are very shadowy, right? Malcolm Todd, historian, defined the Gepids as the most shadowy of all the major Germanic peoples of the migration period, specifically, which maybe is excessive, but considering the importance of the Gepids altogether is fitting. In relative terms, it can actually be. And the point being that nor Tacitus nor Ptolemy mentioned them in their detailed lists of the barbarians in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. The Gepids appear only in the late 3rd century AD, right? And by this time they are already living in or near, at least, the area where they remained for the rest of their known history. Let's not make further hypotheses like, were the Gepids, born in a very different way from a Scandinavian migration, were they coming from other pre-existing peoples? We have no clue, right? Surely altogether their culture sounds and looks Germanic enough, but even in here, yeah, we use this approximation of Germanic, but it's, things was much more shaded and complex. According to the unreliable Augustan history of Emperor Claudius Gothicus, the Gepids were involved in the so-called Scythian invasion of the Roman provinces in the Balkan Peninsula in 269. When, however, they were routed, this is realistic. Scythian at this point is a ethnographical cliche. It means all these peoples coming from this broader eastern area, and surely including Iranian populations, like the remnants of the Scythians or the Sarmatians, that actually if you know a bit the geography of this settlement, the Sarmatians basically fitted in between Pannonia and Dacia at the point, right? They mostly dwelled in the east, but a part of them entered in this wedge that is exactly the one that would form basically the boundary between the Pannonian lands and the Gepidic ones in the east. So at a point, these peoples, as we've seen, as the Goths think, they were heavily influenced by the Iranian populations, the Sarmatians specifically, and they surely joined in these raids that were mostly, leagues of peoples fighting, say, together, still under their own, still fragmented, right, making mass to raid the richer lands of the empire. Among these peoples in the incursion, there are the Greutungi, the Ostrogoths, the Tervingi, and the Vesi. That altogether, that there is all this problem in equating them to. These are all terms that eventually, Vesi sometimes is associated with Visigoths, but there's no certainty. Tervingi might have been, something connected more to this, Western Gothic branch. Same goes for the Ostrogoths with the Greutungi. For the East is concerned, it's a bit complex, but they're still part of that thing, orientatively speaking. Yes, this proves in a way that the Gepids were with the Goths, in a sense. There were also the Paeocini that were a branch of the Bastarnae, right? The Heruli, and the Celts, even. So this tells you about the broader ethnic complexity of these populations. And the same source also says that the Emperor Probus, who ruled between 276 and 282, settled Gepid, Vandals, and Greutungi prisoners of war in the Roman Empire in the Balkans, right? Which actually speaks for a defeat of these peoples, as it had happened during the incursion, but perhaps something more. I mean, the Romans launched their incursions in their own territories as well, and it was a norm at that point, but much before actually, to settle these peoples at that point to be not just like the federative would become as a unique peoples, but scattered to eventually dilute in the rest of the population to have more labor force and manpower during the crisis of the 3rd century. Consider that the Danubian frontier at this point was being ravaged by all these movements, especially one of the Goths that were, in fact, as we've seen here, involved importantly in the thing. So you can imagine the synthesis, the hybrid of all these various Roman, Germanic, Sarmatian contexts in the area. In a moment also of decay, think about the Roman Dacia that had basically been abandoned, where these peoples pushed also to settle in the area. In the 11th panegyric to the Emperor Maximian, given in Trier in 291, which is also the first time the Tervingi and the Taifali were mentioned, right? This is very important groups, as we've seen. The Tervingi were resented, Taifali were also a group of, we don't even know where there were Germans or Sarmatians. That would be important. They figure also in the Roman army, and they had this importance. Consider also the mobility. We find them stationed a bit all over the empire's units, so that tells you how far and wide they travel. And the passage described a battle outside the empire. It's important that is outside the empire, where the Gepids were on the side of the Vandals, attacked by Taifali and a part of the Goths. So here we find, once again, this attrition between the Gepids and the Goths, right? Specifically, together with, respectively, the Vandals and the Taifali. The other part of the Goths had, in the meanwhile, defeated the Burgundians, who were supported by the Tervingi and the Alemanni. So, think even in these areas, we know basically nothing about how complex the political relations were. These were peoples who eventually would take different directions. Think about the Vandals. They're arriving in Spain, Africa. The Goths go the other side. The Burgundians passed to also eventually the Rhine as well. The Alemanni were settled in another area. So this is kind of messed up. But that tells you how turbulent the area was, Central Europe. And the Gepids were, however, let's say, still largely unknown to the Roman sources. For example, they do not appear in the Verona list. That is a list of Roman provinces from the times of the Roman emperors Diocletian and Constantine I. It also had kind of stabilized the era. Was a time of, surely greater reassessment also of the boundaries of the empire during the crisis of the 3rd century. Or, for example, in the histories of Ammianus and Orosius that talked importantly about these other groups of people. So this may speak for either still an important distance of the Gepids from Rome, but also maybe of a less importance compared to other groups, or both, right? Modern scholars who write of the Gepids' early history sometimes apply what is being called a mixed argumentation, combining Jordanes' narration with the results of archaeological research. And here there is a great debate on when the Gepids would have settled in the Carpathian basin. Bona says that, for example, that the battle mentioned above in the panegyric was about 209 in the former province of Dacia itself, equating it to the battle mentioned by Jordanes involving Fastid against the western branch of the Goths, right? But there is no evidence of this. Horrid also equates it to the battle involving Fastida, but proposes that this might have been fought east of the Carpathian Mountains, so out of the basin, and more to the Gothic area after 248, and also in this sense before the withdrawal of the Romans from the province of Dacia in the early 270s. Walter Paul, very important scholar, also says that the battle might have been fought at this point between 248 and 291, and it might have been in or out the curve of the Carpathians in this sense, albeit he still opts for the idea that this was within the Dacian borders, and more specifically in Transylvania, roughly meant from a geographical point of view. So still close to the area where eventually the Gepids would have settled. Which, considering, well, yes, I mean, considering the Gepidic activity is possible, right? These guys were confident enough to move east. They got apparently defeated, or at least there was a sort of stall in that, so they probably didn't go back who knows where. They still dwelled in the area. The Gepids' history in the 4th century is unknown, which doesn't help, as no written source mentions them during this period. Right, the silence of Roman sources suggests that either their homeland did not border on the Roman Empire, or that they weren't so, in size as a people altogether, as we've seen. On the basis of Jordanes' reference to the rugged mountains, as we've seen before, the Gepids' lands, scholars locate it near the Carpathians, as we said before. And it's been hypothesized that this could have been already along the upper courses either of the Tisza or in the east of the Dniester rivers in the late 3rd century. So it's still this area across the Carpathians. And the exact date of the Gepid settlement in the Carpathian Basin cannot exactly be determined. Bona says that the Gepids might have settled in the region already since the 260s. Oprianu says around 300. Ivanovic and Kultsar write that there is actually at least no evidence of Gepidic settlement in the Carpathian Basin before 350. Also consider that these peoples didn't migrate all in one block. So it's possible that the movement actually occurred over time. As we said before, there was no unique king. These were all, Fachgemeinschaften. So they were completely, they were all clans that were autonomously moving and, let's say, gradually infiltrating also in areas where habitated by other people. This was the norm at the time. So it might have been actually a gradual thing. Graves from the 4th century, which yielded swords, lances, and shields with iron bows, were unearthed in cemeteries between the rivers Tisza and Körös, that is in today's northeastern Hungary and northwestern Romania. Many scholars attribute those graves to Gepid warriors. And that's where we start saying, okay, we're fairly sure we're talking about them. Dating is another problem, actually, but still we see the thing happening. Graves of women from the same cemeteries produced artifacts including bronze and silver clasps, bone combs, and fibulae, which are similar to objects found in cemeteries nearby the Santana de Mureș Cherniakov culture. As you can imagine, a lot of hybridization going on. Bona writes that the spread of these cemeteries shows that the Gepids subjugated the Germanic Pictoali, who previously inhabited the same region, and before expanding towards the Mureș River in the middle of the 4th century, which is possible, actually. I disagree with important things that Bona says, but this can be actually. Interesting things, ever more interesting things start happening with the Hanik domination. That, as you know, was actually a very importantly defining moment for all the peoples that came under their control, and the Gepids seemingly had a role of protagonists within the Hanik subjects, together with the Ostrogoths. We know fairly well that between 405 406, a large group of diverse people from the region of the Middle Danube crossed the river Rhine, right, and invaded the Roman Empire, Gaul more specifically. It was a kind of a seat height, and most contemporary sources list the Vandals, the Alans, the Sueves among the invaders. According to Saint Jerome, who lived in Bethlehem at that time, however, also the Gepids also participated in the invasion. This is interesting because it shows that within the same populations there were those who actually wanted or managed, could escape from the Hanik pressure that had also triggered important part of these movements, maybe indirectly also from the push for the others that were in between them in the east. And it's actually normal to see same peoples sometimes cut in half in the process. I mean, the same people, actually a group fighting for the Huns, another for the Romans. And there is actually nothing strange of that, considering also that all these populations had war bands that made war for a living, that went abroad, toured extensively, and therefore they might have simply found themselves cut off, sometimes from their original peoples. But here we're talking specifically even proper groups of, with civilians and so on that decided to escape the Hanik invasion. So, according to scholarly theory, the westward migration of the Huns forced the tribes to flee from the Carpathian Basin to seek refuge in the Roman Empire, right? And among them, it's likely that the Gepids were among them. However, we know that the bulk of them remained in the area, right? The Middle Danube region was subsequently dominated by the peoples from the east, associated with Goths and Huns together. Jordanus reports that Torismond, king of the Ostrogoths, who was subjected to the Huns, quote, won a great victory over the Gepids, but fell in battle. This is very interesting, because basically the Ostrogoths were some of the favorites of the most favorite of the Huns. What was happening here is that once you decided to remain under the Huns, or maybe you couldn't do otherwise, let's remember that, the Visigoths had already broken through the empire, that they were from the Roman side at that point. Well, these others had naturally to carve their own space under the Huns, and the elites especially were very much involved in the process, because the Germans were traditionally about the idea of not making a specific chieftain race to become too powerful to oppress the freemen and so on. It's not that the freemen behaved differently, but they did still on a smaller scale. The Hanik domination instead accelerated the process of the creation of elites, right, and chiefs, right, because it's much easier to control a people if you have specific heads and rather than all scattered clans that you cannot control together. So this brought also to a process of Hanization of the elites that is well reflected even in the acquisition of certain equestrian zootechnic capabilities. Yes, the East Germans were already a bit more acquainted with that since the time that they met with the Sarmatians and so on, but this is properly not a military but a political and social change, right? The elites becoming stronger and the freemen becoming more oppressed and being ever more forced, coerced, to participate also to the military effort that the Huns required. This is dramatically important in Gepidic history, as we will see. And what Jordanus says here about the Ostrogoths under the Huns defeating the Gepids, but still suffering the death of their king in the process, as we'll see now, reflects the importance that eventually the Gepids would have maintained also under the Huns. Because yes, they were defeated, kind of. We don't even know whether this battle actually took place, but in a way or another they were subjugated. Still, they had bled the Ostrogoths white. They had fought. This reveals that they were importantly, they were an important tribe because the Ostrogoths weren't, were important, were powerful. Still, they had been suffering this important Hunnic wave that basically destroyed their Ukrainian kingdom, but they still were strong enough to subjugate it. They were possibly some of the strongest at that point, if not the strongest, who knows, of the Germanic peoples. Well, the Gepids are defeated, but still they inflict important losses. And this probably makes them earn a place next to the same Ostrogoths under the Huns. Jordanus suggests that the Gepids were forced to accept the overlordship of the Ostrogoths within the emerging Hanik Empire. And we find, interestingly enough, from an archaeological point of view, a treasure of gold jewels, which was at this locality of Neo Silvaniae in Romania, that was hidden in the first decades of the 5th century. And most probably in connection with the struggles ending with the Gepids' subjection to the Huns, right? According to Bona, which I like to see in the same way, that this process of hoarding, of treasuring, an important part of precious metals that was essentially the bit of the wealth of the elites here, right? These were still kind of semi-nomadic populations. I mean, the Germans were fundamentally sedentary, but during the migration period, as you understand, were pretty much, they put themselves in motion to be more, at least ready to the idea of moving, being on the move. Precious metals were very important. Also, as far as the relation with the Roman Empire was concerned, the barbarians were ever more in need of, good quality metal, and this was owned by the elites, and it represented a movable wealth, right? Just like the cattle, not the land, even which could be lost or ruined and whatever. So this thing, but when the Huns arrived, the Ostrogoths attacked the Gepids, we can think were hidden, were treasured. There were plenty of legions of all these treasures scattered. They're still found all over Europe, connected to that specific moment of the invasions. Right, the enemies were coming. You didn't know what to do. This wealth was very important. You didn't want to be caught with it, so you buried it somewhere, hoping that when the storm would have passed, you could have come back. But some would never be. Some would go lost because either the owners were killed, exterminated, or they forgot where it was, and so on. But this is an important evidence of the storm that actually the Huns produced. Right, the Huns are, generally speaking, a bit overrated compared to other peoples in that came from the East in European history, but indeed they caused a very big effect in the area. The Gepid warriors in this context fought on the side of the Huns during the next decades. And according to Jordanus, Attila the Hun prized very much Harderic, king of the Gepids, and Valamir, king of the Ostrogoths, because they were, quote, above all the other chieftains, right, who were subjected to the Huns in the 440s, according to the same author. Now, Ardaric is a fascinating character because he's thought to have also been the inspiration for Hydrarch in the the Germanic legions, and might in fact remained in the Germanic memory of the time for the important role that he had under the Hanik domination and the deeds he accomplished in that thing. I mean, the time of the Huns is also from where the Nibelungen lead comes from. It was a moment of great deeds after all, right? This kind of bitter realization that, yeah, the Germans now, at least those ones, were under the Huns, but still, the idea that this was the time also of these great leaders rising, right? Of these, lineages, in a sense, also taking control on the same peoples as we've seen before in a way that never happened, right? So these single heroes that begin to emerge, and this may be as well, in fact, the product, even in the oral tradition of the deeds of let's say of this incipient monarchies, we could call them in that way, and not the peoples proper. And this is very meaningful because there are certain Germanic legions that are actually myths of people, not of men, right? These are men instead, right? They are specific leaders. And this role is, next to the Ostrogoths, is fantastic, right? Because the Ostrogoths were really good, right, in terms of military quality and so on, albeit they had been importantly shattered at this point. The Gepids, at this point, are even rivaling with them. And this is fascinating, right? The Ostrogoths had it really hard, having lost their kingdom in the Black Sea. The Gepids here were probably more stable people that stayed where it was, and maybe they didn't have so much to lose as much as the Ostrogoths. So, but they also came from a context where they had struggled hard, that they had probably a good political cohesion at this point, so that the thing balanced, and that's why they had this important role under Attila, who praised these leaders themselves. Some scholars actually says that it's even possible that Gepids had a greater importance than the Ostrogoths under Attila, right? I personally don't know. It may even be, honestly. But, and there are some hints. If you look at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains now, the important role that the Gepids had could be, but I think we do not know for sure. The Gepids' participation in the Huns' campaigns against the Roman Empire brought them much booty, right, contributing to the development of a rich Gepid aristocracy. And this wealth was to be accumulated in the centuries to come, but at the same time would trigger that specific political social change for which the elites got particularly rich, but the people likely impoverished. And this would be an important weakness for the Gepids, and differently from other Germanic peoples. And this seems to have been evident during the Longobard-Gepidic wars, where the Longobards seemingly had a much better off middle class that was more warlike. The people was more cohesive in that sense, whereas the Gepid aristocracy was very rich, but also was very narrow and had excluded the freemen that weren't equipped so well. We know from the grave findings and so on. So we get that distinct impression. This is fascinating also because the Longobards actually were under the Huns, but they didn't underwent the same level of stratification from a political social point of view. And the Longobards actually being the people that possibly remained the longest under Hunnic domination till the very end. And this is also interesting considering the Battle of Nedao and the leading role that the Gepids had at that point in an anti-Hunnic sense, where also seemingly the Ostrogoths sided still with the Huns, and all these connections eventually between the Ostrogoths, the Longobards, and the Gepids, as far as we'll see now, especially for the control of Sirmium in the 6th century, are fascinating because of the pre-existing history, as far as we can just hypothesize. Isolated graves of 5th century aristocratic women evidence Gepid leaders well. These were fighting, as we've seen, for the Huns, so the Huns were rewarding them and creating, and probably the fact that the Gepids were so well rewarded also speaks for the fact that they were not so radically dangerous, and that maybe the same Huns wanted to counterbalance some other people's wealth, maybe one of the Ostrogoths, just equating a bit, controlling better all this very large group of peoples, right? Hunnic domination seems to have stretched even up to Scandinavia. I mean, namely because formally because that with the recognition claim, but it was difficult to maintain them all control. We know that these women from the nobility wore heavy silver fibulas on their shoulders, bead necklaces, silver bracelets, large gold earrings, and silver clasps on their clothes and belts, which is definitely a rich set. And a countless host under the command of Ardaric, right, formed the right wing, famously enough, of the army of Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451. And on the eve of the main encounter between allied hordes, the Gepids and Franks met each other, the latter fighting the Romans, and the former the Huns, and seemed to have fought one another to a standstill with 15,000 dead. It was a bloodbath, right? And the role of the Gepids in front of the Romans is actually a great compliment the Huns made. These subjects, right, and think even just about the, as we were saying before, this bit, the Roman party and the Hunnic party within the Germanic peoples scatter across Europe, and the fact that they, fighting for one or the other also means to acquire a different vision, a different political culture in some way. The Gepids stand, I can say, in between, because they seem, in fact, superficially Romanized peoples compared, to the Goths, but even partly to the Franks that also weren't a big. It's very slight differences, but for those times, balance being actually very important. Attila the Hun, as you know, died in 453, and unexpectedly conflicts among his sons developed into a civil war, enabling finally the subject peoples to rise up in rebellion. And according to Jordanus, the Gepid king Ardaric, is always him, who, quote, became enraged because so many nations were being treated like slaves of the basest condition, was the first to take up arms against the Huns. The decisive battle was fought at the unidentified Nedao River in Pannonia in 454-455. And in the battle, the united army of Gepids, Rugi, Sarmatians, and Swabia routed the Huns and their allies, including the Ostrogoths. Right? It was the Gepids who took the lead among the old allies of Attila in establishing one of the largest and most independent new kingdoms, thus acquiring the capital of steam that sustained their kingdom for more than a century. This passage is of dramatic importance. Right? So first of all, Jordanus tells us how Ardaric basically took the lead in this phase, because in spite of these populations having fought for the Huns, as you understand, they hadn't liked it particularly much. They were forced to do it. The elites had adapted for personal gain. Ardaric surely being, the leader also in this regard, but naturally seizing the opportunity of Hunnic weakness and the realization, especially that this great empire and all its riches were to disgregate, that he decides to rise because he believes that it's there is a bit of a hypocrisy here, right? The idea that these peoples were treated like slaves. Yes, you can imagine, as first of all, the peoples surely being treated like that by the Huns, but regarding the inner policy of the domestic, let's say, policy of the same peoples, as we've seen, the elites were the ones that had allowed it to happen, and also partly undermined the let's say the wealth, or the strength of the freeman class. So naturally, there was a great sentiment, let's say, resentment towards the Huns from the side of the freemen altogether, and Arderic would now collect that to use it against the Huns, and that's naturally clever, because not only he sees that opportunity, but because he was able, let's say, to switch a bit the policy, domestically speaking, to still to remain the leader in that sense. This battle of Nedao is very important in European history, we can say, because we realize the controversial aspect of what the Hunnic experience had been. There were peoples, as the Ostrogoths or even the Longobards, that for contingent reasons preferred actually to remain under the Huns up to that point, since the Huns now were declining and becoming just one of the other actors, so some of them might have the reason to back them. It's interesting that it's been fought in Pannonia as well, so close wherever the Huns had their fortified ring where they treasured all their riches and so on. In fact, that the Gepids were close to that is also important, that they would settle in the Pannonian plain, in part, not just into the Carpathian basin in Transylvania. So having actually a foot on important crossroads, both in the west and in the south, with the Tisza, the Danube, right? Not just the Carpathian basin, and having therefore these important ambitions. And the fact that here is striking is that the Gepids were some of the strongest, or the strongest of all these peoples, right? At least those who fought against the Huns, taking the lead specifically, and through victory achieving the creation properly of a kingdom, right? That at this point is something different from what the Gepids had before. Even if the elites have a tighter grip on the rest of the people, and they get an area that, as we've seen, had been fundamentally the area of Dacia had been partly Romanized, but also not so deeply so that actually what was there went largely lost in terms, but still was important enough. The region being rich in precious metals, not being dramatically good for agriculture, definitely, but still facing some important fertile regions such as Mesia, right? Controlling this strategic crossroads with the various, the Danube, the various rivers that flow into it. So, and the Carpathians being a bit of a shield from the invasions of these swarms of peoples that still wander around, especially in the east, in the Ukrainian plain, and so on. This is important because eventually the Ostrogoths also gather again, standing on their feet, and would become stronger than the Gepids, right? So the Gepids do not acquire actually such a dramatic power. They do not become objectively some of the big ones of the migration era. They also do not seem that they really want to move from where they are, right? They're not a people on the march. They're not seizing the opportunity like the Ostrogoths or eventually the Longobards to move. Also, they are defeated more than once. So this raises questions on how consistent now the Gepids were in as a cohesive power, and the question is the elites once again, right? The fact that probably the middle classes had impoverished, and the elites had becoming consistently rich, but being in this sense more detached from the rest of the population, or transformed it in a bit more of a subject-like manner, probably didn't work well for the broader cohesion of the people as such, and the possibility of channeling, let's say, the fantasies, the ambitions, the lust of prey, etc., of a strong middle class of a people on the march that could conquer such dramatically developed lands. Right? Dacia was not a dramatically developed land. It was a fairly good one, especially for a people that had always lived in the Barbaricum, that hadn't known much of the taste of civilization, but still look at the Goths, right? They knew where real wealth was. They knew where real opportunities were. Those were within the Roman Empire. The Gepids preferred to stay just aside, right? And we do not know more than much about this. What was their decisional process, their political, strategical thinking, but they still made important choices that brought them to obtain on the long run also an important power, control on certain important centers. Think about Singidunum or Sirmium and so on, but still failing in the end. I will see now how it partly happened. So as we've seen after the last thing I actually wanted to say, this broader international recognition that it may have received, surely that was an important one, but let's also remember that the Hanik experience had been a failure in itself. These peoples actually had been under the Huns, so in a way or another they lost, right? The same Gepids suffering, as we've seen, those atrocious losses at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. At this point, even some thousands of people are a very important number in demographic terms for the consistency of this population. These were, yes, the Germans altogether were many, but speaking of how many warriors they might have had, they had a few tens of thousands, right? And that also included kind of every kind of fighter. So important losses like that were not to be replaced from a day to another, could consistently cripple even the power of entire people. So about these balances, unfortunately, from a quantitative point of view, we do not have any positive evidence, but at the same time, knowing the various stages of these defeats that were traumatic, right, from a structural point of view, we know at the time, these pre-industrial societies were very delicate as far as this demographic matters were concerned. So a defeat, once again, is a powerful indicator, right, of that. And Nedao is a victory. It shows Gepids are strong, but still, this happens in the Barbaricum, in areas that were had not been part of the Roman Empire, that had been ravaged by these newcomers, that had been, as we've seen, squeezed because these peoples had fought over and over again for the Huns, right? So they had suffered consistently, and therefore it wasn't all pink and happy and especially these people, as we've said, didn't show specific need to move dramatically forward in the international arena, right? So surely they won the recognition of these other populations that had followed them against the Huns, and surely they were the ones who defeated the Huns, those who freed themselves from them. So that's an important thing, right? That's why also Ardaric was remembered in the Germanic epics and so on, and that surely was well deserved. At the same time, you have to be realistic about the possibilities overall and the condition of these populations. So after the Battle of Nedao, the Hanik Empire, as we've seen, disintegrated, and the Gepids became the dominant power in the eastern regions of the Carpathian Basin. Right? According to Jordanus, the Gepids, quote, by their own might won for themselves the territory of the Huns, and ruled as victors over the extent of all Dacian. Right? It wasn't enormous, right, but still, nor even dramatically developed, but they still were a power that disturbed the Roman Empire, so much that Jordanus says that they demanded the same empire, nothing more than peace, and an annual gift after their victory. Which is like, according to Jordanus, a few, right? They didn't begin to be thugs at the same time. They just wanted their tribute, as many peoples who had, as the Romans normally paid to many peoples, but still telling the empire that they were there. They wanted probably to be left alone, to have, a fair relation with Constantinople, but still, let's say, winning their recognition in that regard. Emperor Marcian confirmed the Gepidic status as the allies of the empire. Right? It was important even for Constantinople to maintain the a stability on the Danubian frontier. They didn't want trouble either. And in fact, he granted the Gepids an annual subsidy of 100 pounds of gold. The late 5th century treasures excavated at Apahida and Somesheni showed that the Gepid rulers accumulated great wealth in the second half of the century. So here the elites keep getting richer, right, and fatter. And once again, this speaks for probably at least a decreased freeman power that was exploited by the elites to get richer for themselves, and however still not managing to exploit much else of a strength for what had remained of these peoples. However, the contrasts with the Ostrogoths continued, right? Because the Ostrogoths also had remained alive after all this, and actually had regained forces. A bit, the Ostrogoths were very proud about what they had in the east before the Huns arrived, and therefore were trying to reconstitute now, probably naturally in a very different manner, in a much more, let's say, nomadic mindset. That also the the Hunnic domination had an important impact on the Ostrogoths. Also, their elites probably had been strengthened. They had settled in Pannonia, so they were next door to the Gepids themselves. The Gepids joined a coalition formed by the Suebi, the Syrian, the Sarmatians, and other peoples against the Ostrogoths, because evidently, altogether, they perceived it as a threat, and this speaks for also the Ostrogothic power still at the time. And in fact, the Ostrogoths routed the united forces of their enemies in the Battle of Bolia in 469. Right, so the Ostrogoths confirmed that, despite the Gepids had their own time, they were the strongest around still, right? And there is no question about this. I mean, the Ostrogoths were many, right? They were strong. They had lived under tough times. They were aware of their past. They had been the big ones, right? Remember, these were the ones who had led the invasion. The Gepids, if we want to believe Jordanus, had been the ones who came later, according to them, and they had never quite liked them particularly, as we have seen. They had already fought against them, they had already defeated them. The Gepids just, however, had been resilient enough to stay on their feet and to strike back. So, but in fact, the Gepids do not give up, right? And the Ostrogoths eventually left Pannonia in 473. At this point, the Gepids captured Sirmium, now Sremska Mitrovica in Serbia, that, as you know, was one of the most strategically important centers in the area, placed on the road between Italy and Constantinople, right? And that's also where the broader connections of the Goths had remained, because eventually the Goths would migrate into Italy, and still, however, on behalf of Constantinople, at least from a formal point of view. So in 489, Traustila, king of the Gepids, tried to hinder the Ostrogoths from crossing the river Vuka, that is fundamentally in eastern Croatia. It's a right tributary of the Danube River. During Theodoric's great campaign against Italy, against Odoacer, right? That was a 3 years war. The Goths were fighting against these Germanic bands that constituted the basic what had remained left of the army of Italy. There was this important siege in Ravenna. At the end of the day, Theodoric made a video about the Ostrogoths, actually more than one, seized control of Ravenna, killed Odoacer, and ruled over Italy. And not only, but he took back Sicily from the Vandals, and he still controlled the Alpine passes of Raetia, Pannonia, and up to, in fact, to the Illyrian, these lands, Dalmatia. That the Gepids, at this point, they try to act a bit sneaky, and they actually fail, because the Ostrogoths rout Traustila's army while he was trying to cut the crossing. So once again, another Gepidic defeat at the hands of the Ostrogoths. So once again, that speaks for the ratio of strength in that sense. The Gepids also lost Sirmium to the Ostrogoths, at least according to Walter Paul. The Sirmium was was contended because it was always where and another on a frontier, right? So it was easy to pass in the hands of this or that, but it was of dramatic strategic importance. And according to Goffart, Trausila's son, Trasaric, quote, regained control of Sirmium, possibly under Ostrogothic underlordship, which means, objectively, yes, Sirmium was the easternmost corner of the Ostrogothic dominions. Gepids were just next door, it was much closer to their center of power, so maybe the Ostrogoths said, okay, well, you can't control that. And we know, in fact, that there is a very important, for example, minting activity of the Gepidic kings from Sirmium, very Romanized, but also displaying very important symbolisms and kind of idea of public authority that also the same Ostrogoths and eventually the Longobards would be influenced by. There are important angelic representations, such as one of the Archangel, St. Michael Archangel would be so important, was being revived as a figure, a military figure, of course, the eminent military figure in the Judeo-Christian tradition in the Roman Empire at the time, and the Germans were totally obsessed with it, the Longobards, the Ostrogoths as well. So there is this important Gepidic connection that's been overlooked, right? Albeit the control in Sirmium seems to have been intermittent, right? Also because technically it was to be part of the same lands that the empire wanted to control, right? So the Ostrogoths now we're in good terms with Constantinople, so it's not they quarreled too much about the control of those lands. Also because the Ostrogoths were acting in behalf of the empire. The Saint Gepids were, as we've seen, a contained threat, but the empire was always there, was ready to strike in a way. But there was never like a kind of a breaking point, right? It's not that everybody acted stupid. They maintained their control on the thing, and the hostility was mostly between the Goths and the Gepids at that point. In fact, Theodoric the Great, at a certain point, dispatched one commander, Pythia, to launch a campaign against the Gepids, who either tried to capture Sirmium again or wanted to get rid of Theodoric's suzerainty in 504, because also remember in this situation, and we talked about it more than once, of the dramatic importance never achieved, if not later by the Merovingians and the Carolingians, of a Germanic power like the Ostrogoths in international arenas, especially as far as the, let's say, pro-Germanic and Arian party against the Catholic Roman one embodied by the Merovingians and naturally Constantinople was concerned, right? The Gepids in this here act a bit in between, because they're literally between Constantinople and Ravenna, so that they act, they just play their cards, whatever they were, but technically they were also under the Ostrogothic power that at this point was enormous after the conquest of Italy. And of course the Gepids in Dacia, what could they do at the end of the day? In fact, Comes Pythia expelled the Gepid troops from Sirmium, seemingly without much resistance, right? And this might have been even less dramatic than it sounds altogether. Also, in an attempt to take advantage of the death of Theodoric the Great in 526, the Gepids invaded the region of Sirmium in 528 or 530. But again, Vitiges defeated them. So these attempts, consider that, this, once again, were literally the frontiers of the Ostrogothic dominion. And yet all the time, despite the Gepids were so close to Sirmium as center of power, they failed all the time. Right? So this speaks for the broader relation of strength. The Gepids, however, still consolidate their power gradually, reaching their zenith after 537. Not surprisingly, also because of the Gothic War, so that where the Ostrogoths were being wiped out by the Byzantines in Italy, right? So that is the moment in which they are able to re-expand in the area. In fact, they settle in the rich area around Singidunum, that is today's Belgrade, right? And coming close also, naturally, to Sirmium, which was retaken, and becoming effectively the center of, let's say, the Gepid state as far, especially as the monarchic public power. One of the elites was concerned, right? The King Cunimund melted golden coins in Sirmium. That was a great, capacity, the recognition of an important power in the area. Naturally, the bulk of the properly ethnic Gepidic power was still in the Carpathian Basin, but controlling that city equated to take a step further, which is what started actually to worry the Byzantines, right? And in fact, in 546, the empire allies itself with the Longobards that had defeated the Heruli, had basically expanded in the Pannonian basin. They were facing each other, like the Longobard power arrived up to the Danube, right? Then there is this stripe of land that goes from north to south that arrives to the Tisza River that runs parallel to the Danube. That point where the Gepids are, and that was the frontier, and it's also kind of the heart of the Pannonian Plain. So we can imagine also a lot of equestrian warfare going on, raiding warfare that is typical of the area. We know a lot of intersection actually in material culture between the Longobards and the Gepids at the time, but it's not that they hated each other particularly at the beginning, but over time they began to get in attrition, and eventually the thing would escalate into open warfare that lasted for a long time. The Longobard-Gepidic wars were actually pretty tough, and that's where also the empire enters into action, because the Romans, as we've seen, ally themselves with the Longobards, and the Longobards manage to defeat the Gepids on the battle on the Asphalt. Right, the Gepids suffered a disastrous defeat. In fact, Albumin, king of the Longobards, killed Cunimund, king of the Gepids, making a drinking cup out of his skull. Right, and these are kind of things that those peoples did at the time. And the Longobard Gepid wars were long. Right, the thing happened basically like this, and we will talk about this in a dedicated video. So today we do not enter into the details, but it's interestingly documented, at least because Paul the Deacon, that was a Longobard living in the 8th century, but at least he objectively wrote consistent things about the past of the Longobards, and we know also from the various diplomacy here involved. These are now both the Longobards and Gepids are within the radar of Constantinople. So we know historically how the thing happened. So initially, the Romans, as we have seen, were worried of Gepid expansion. They allied themselves with the Longobards. There were the Byzantines were sheltering certain Thuringians that were married into the Longobards that sent them to their help. The Gepids got Hanik help, right? So there were other peoples who went fighting along the place, but the point is that, however, the clash was truly between the Longobards and the Gepids as two peoples, right? And people say, the Gepids got defeated at the Battle of the Asphalt because the Romans helped the Longobards. That's a bit far-fetched, because actually that was the moment in which the Gothic War was going on. So the Byzantines were busy in Italy and in putting down rebellions in Illyria. And not only we do not have evidence of Roman troops participating to the Battle of Asphalt or the war there in the Pannonian Plain, but also we have evidence of the Longobards actually sending thousands of cavalrymen plus retinues to the Byzantines to fight in Italy for them. So that's a moment that the Longobards were well enforced on their own, and from this historical accounts, they basically defeated the Gepids all alone. But this didn't mean, however, that the Gepids were completely defeated. Actually, the war, relations changed at that point, because when the Longobards defeated the Gepids, now the Romans began to freak out. So much that Constantinople allies itself with the Gepids in turn, You see, the Romans had a bit nurtured the same Longobard monarchy that was beginning to form with Audoin and Alboin and so on, to put together this people that was very, as we've seen, had an important freeman bulk. So it's not that the monarchy could do more than much, but the Romans are interested in the Longobards at this point, but the Longobards crushed the Gepids in that battle, and that changes the ratio of strength. Also, the Longobards wanted to seize Sirmium. And what happens is that now the Romans are together with the Gepids against the Longobards. So the Longobards ally themselves with the Avars, right? And these are kind of subtle. It's a proxy war, telling the truth. It's not that the Romans are openly at war with Longobards. Actually, the same migration of the Longobards in Italy was a pacific thing, and it seems by all means that it was actually planned together with the Romans, that didn't send any army there when the thing happened. Then the thing went out of hand, evidently, for how things would develop later, but it's not that the kind of hating each other. I mean, nobody liked each other. The Romans didn't like nor the Gepids nor the Longobards. The Longobards and Gepids didn't like each other. But they were just struggling for power in this Pannonian area that was becoming crowded by peoples that evidently were, scrupulous about, what they wanted to seize. So what the Longobards do is that they ally themselves with this Turkic people of the Avars, or they surely had a more complex ethnogenesis, but that were a hell of a warlike people. At this time, telling the truth, the Avars were still fragmented. They began to migrate towards the west, and therefore, the Longobards were from attacking the Gepids from the west, the Avars from the east. But the Avars were not the mighty military machine that would get like in 50 years from then. They were still all fragmented. They were fearful enough for actually the Longobards to finally defeat the Gepids, right, in 567, and to basically absorb the same Gepids. Like the Avars settled in the Gepidic lands that were promised actually by the same Longobards to the Avars in exchange of their help. Part of the Gepids were actually incorporated into the Longobard people because they either were taken prisoners, enslaved, or actually they fled to the Longobards because they didn't like the Avars, at least, being defeated by someone you still prefer other Germanic kings than these people that, are coming from very different reality, and they're much harsher also in the way they cope with the subject populations. And eventually, the Longobards migrated into Italy, actually making an agreement with the Avars that if the migration had failed, they could have come back to the Pannonian lands. But it was evident that nor the Longobards nor the Avars liked each other at all. Right? The Longobards were many, so it's not that the Avars were so eager to engage war with them, because they weren't, as we said before, the absolute masters that came and subjugated everyone. No, they still had to compose their own khaganate specifically, and that cohesion, that unity that would be necessary eventually in a few generations to launch attacks even on Constantinople or as far as the Merovingian Germany and so on. Also, the Longobards and the Avars would be friendly, right? I think there was just one raid into northeastern Italy, and that was it, right? By the Avars, and they were allies for most of the time. At some point, the Longobards would even send certain shipbuilders to the Avars to build a fleet on the Black Sea to attack Constantinople. That we'll talk about that at some point. But let's say I'm saying this because the idea that the Longobards left Pannonia for Italy just because they fear the Avars is actually not confirmed by historical evidence, right? Surely that might have been a reason more not to create that attrition, and also because the Pannonian plain is open, right? And just like the Huns, the Avars, and eventually the Hungars, that is the preferential center of a kind of equestrian, semi-nomadic population, like these ones coming from the east. And simply, Italy is way better than Pannonia. It's rich, it's urbanized. The Longobards would actually create a big deal in there, which is something dramatically overlooked, and we explained it many times, that this stupid prejudice of the bloodthirsty barbarians is actually just a very clever and absolutely effective papal Byzantine propaganda was effectively used at the time, but the Longobards weren't that at all. And they created in Italy something that was light years ahead, I don't know, compared to the Franks in terms of public culture, and that was an important, source, in fact, for the eventually in the 8th century for the development of the Carolingian institutions and so on. But hey, everybody likes to believe that the prejudice they want. But the balance here is between the peoples is actually fascinating, and the Gepids basically disappear, right? They are overrun by the Avars, but they still remain, right? They still remain as an important part of their, of the Carpathian Basin's identity under the Avar domination. There is also the process of Slavization in all this, but here the Gepid history proper ends. So we'll talk about this maybe on another occasion. There's actually in Romania many beautiful archaeological sites where all these beautiful Gepid jewelry, artistry is to be found, and there are definitely traces of the Gepids living on, right? For example, in 630, Theophylact Simocatta reports that a Byzantine army entered the territory of the Avars and attacked a Gepid feast, capturing 30,000 Gepids, right? Without meeting Avars. So it means that, the number is exaggerated, but the idea is that the Gepids, basically, even subjugated, were still living there, and the Avars had not settled, also because the Carpathian Basin is not properly the Pannonian Plain. Right, these were areas also in the south, in the north, think about Slovakia, that where Slavic culture remains, aside from also the Pannonian Plain that was actually Slavicized, right, over time. More after the collapse of the Avars, before the Hungars came, but generally speaking, it was something that went beyond, where it's just the Avars as, say, shepherd peoples, also controlled these movements and were happy to have new subjects, new labor force, manpower to levy, aside from the ones of their elites, of their equestrian, lifestyle and so on. But obviously, the Gepids didn't disappear as people, and they lived on. Recent excavation by the Tisza River at Szolnok brought up a Gepid nobleman from an Avar period, who was also wearing Turkic Avar pieces next to the traditional Germanic clothes in which he was buried. So naturally a lot of syncresis, and the same Gepidic elites probably, buying, just like it had happened on the Huns, the model of the conquerors, right, which was another way of social political promotion, as always. In the 8th century, Paul the Deacon lists Gepid, Bulgarian, Sarmatian, Pannonian, Swabian, and Norican villages in Italy, right? Because at the time of the Longobard conquest, it's not the Longobards migrated in the peninsula with lots of other populations, with Saxons, Thuringians, or in all these peoples. Bulgarians also were settled later at a point in central Italy by Grimoald. But as far as Paul the Deacon says here, we do not know whether he's actually listing communities that still believed to be, Gepid or Sarmatian or Swabian in Italy, but rather, maybe an older source that said the thing, or just saying that there was the memory still that those communities had been associated with these peoples at the beginning, right? But it's still important that the Gepids were not forgotten and that they had such an important part in the process. Think about Rosamond, that was Alboin's wife, and basically had him killed, according to at least to the legend. And we think it was mostly a Byzantine intervention, court plot. Maybe she had nothing to do with that, but she was a Gepidic princess, daughter of Cunimund, that was forced by, according to the story, to drink from her father's skull by Alboin himself as a sort of a humiliation. But actually, the important concept here is how closely also the Longobards had connected themselves with the Gepids, and how they had not wiped them out. Also because consider that the Longobards basically remained always settled in the Pannonian plain from the side, let's say the right bank of the Danube. The Gepids were settled in the Carpathian Basin, so it's not that they were defeated twice by the Longobards and by the Avars last time as well. They, like somebody, the Longobards maybe, needed to invade the base. No, these were just defeats that brought simply to a shift of balance in political and military power, and for, I don't know, those communities even in the Carpathian Basin to be more wary, or maybe paying tributes and so on. But the people didn't disappear, the cohesion of it remained. And even as we've seen under our control, these peoples were still there, right? And that's a bit of the Germanic history of those lands that actually was reinforced also during the High Middle Ages with the German expansion in the east. Think about all the Saxon towns in Romania, some of the most beautiful places in Europe, actually. Beautiful medieval relics, traditions, and that are deeply overlooked, and that are also, aside from the national ideas, propagandas, the deportations, the horrible massacres, and let's say national combating of the 20th century. They were actually, they're part of our history. They're part of a path that we can't trace back even to the migration era in a way, and that is often forgotten. Like the history of, let's call it. This is technically Central Europe, but as far as mostly as the eastern part is also in terms of divide from the last centuries from socialism and all this stuff, obviously has made us overlook so much of the history of certain areas of certain countries, saying, okay, well, why do we need to know that? Well, I think the Gepids show pretty well how complex, how rich, how sometimes mysterious. This is true. Sometimes unknown. There is a reason why. Objectively, there is less to inquire, but still, that is history that happened. That is something that had dramatically more to it, and that we simply do not know. But this is no reason not to get interested, or to overlook it, or to think that these realities didn't have a weight in the world we live in to make it become the one it is. And I would go as far as saying that actually these kingdoms here are probably more important than whatever happened sometimes even in the places of origin of these peoples at the beginning, right? It's not that if you look at Scandinavia, it was a less dynamic, a less complex reality than these ones, right? And these are, this is always a reminder that, of course, we do not have just to read the present in function of just what maybe today is more appreciated for cultural reasons, for just broader interests and so on, but reflecting and thinking of the perspective of those times. I mean, just the fact that those peoples would abandon Scandinavia to go search for a new life in the south, towards the south, pretty obvious, right? All the wealth was concentrated in the south, and these peoples were living sometimes deep crises, deep upheavals, right? That hit, of course, the same Mediterranean, but that brought these peoples to become the protagonists sometimes. And think about the Gepids under the Hunnic domination. That's a hell of a role they had for a people that, in this picture we have drawn, wasn't dramatically powerful, but still knew how to stand his ground. It actually proved to be tough, to be capable, to carve its own space out there, and even to leave a legacy that lived on the centuries. And that is very, very fascinating. However, for now, we stop it here. I hope you enjoyed this special. Actually, I want to make another one like in last years about other Germanic people. I presume after after New Year's Eve, we'll be preparing another of these peoples. It will be maybe less dynamic. This one more sedentary than the others, but still, it's it's here for the migration era. It's important. That also had a very important legacy in Central Europe. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this video as well. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. For now, it's all. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.